Are we live? Okay. I'm Dan Hillenbrand, sometimes leader of this Denver Open Source User Group. Actually, we're looking for some help in that department, so feel free to hit me up. Tonight we have Matt Raible with Reactive Microservices with Spring Boot and, of course, JHipster. I haven't done this in so long, don't know what to do. So I'll thank our sponsors first. Thrive Workplace, too bad we can't pan around and see what they've done to this place. It's a great place for setting up your workspace. And they are sponsoring the location, and we've also got some beer on tap. So if you're at home, sorry you're missing that. Okay, we have Okta developer, which is, of course, Matt's company. All of these, I believe I have links to in the description, so you can check those out. They are doing our video sponsoring tonight. I talked to the guys at PeerSource today, and they're an international, or at least national, recruiting company. And they do have some interesting openings right now, so check them out at mypeersource.com, not peersource.com. Agile Learner, Venkat's training site. We have a subscription for that to give away tonight. Jay Zimmerman's No Fluff Just Stuff, which, as you know, is world-class training for all of us kind of people. JetBrains is going to also sponsors us with a one-year subscription to one of their products, including IntelliJ or some of the others that they have. We have Skilled Distillery. They've been sponsoring our location for quite a while. I'm still in contact with them. They produce some of the best, what do you call the brand new people to the industry? They're, anyway, I've worked with some of these people, and they really do know their stuff. So, let's see here. I guess we're going to go live with Matt here in a moment. So, any questions, comments from the audience before we get started? We do have an audience tonight. That's great. So, I will walk over here, and in a moment, Matt will walk on stage.
All right. I better get your microphone.
Yeah.
People are going to be like, what's going on here? Sweet. All right, so hopefully the 3 people watching on YouTube can hear us and everything's working. My name is Matt Raible, and I'm an old-fashioned Java developer, so to help with that shtick, I got my little Crown Royale here. Notice I even got a matching cup, so get that going. Clear the viewing area. All right. So welcome to Reactive Java Microservices with Spring Boot and JHipster. Is this thing on? There we go. So this presentation is based on a blog post that I wrote called Reactive Java Microservices. And you might notice the font of the microservices. That's Pacifico. And you might have seen it on JHipster's website, jhipster.tech. And you might be asking yourself, what is JHipster? I like to talk about it like a choose-your-own-adventure book, because it allows you to basically choose which technologies you want to generate an app with. It started in 2014, so it's 7 years old now, and it started as just an Angular and Spring generator. So it generated a Spring REST API and a front end in AngularJS. And so a lot's changed since then. We added the ability at one point to do modules. And so what a module is it can modify an existing project that you've already generated. We also added a feature called blueprints that allows you to override the core of what's being generated. So instead of Spring Boot, you can generate Micronaut, or you can do a Quarkus backend. People have even written a .NET backend and a Node.js backend. So there's all different types of backends. The front ones, React, Vue, and Angular are still very popular, and those are part of the core generator. So this is how you get started with JHipster, and I'll go over this again during the demo, but you install it, you create a directory and CD into it. So if you're not familiar with the take command, it does a make dir and CDs into it, so that's pretty handy. And then you run it with the JHipster command. And so there's a whole bunch of questions that it asks you. You can see them here. What type of application are you developing? What's the base name? Do you want to make it reactive with Spring Web Flux? That's an option. And then, microservice, monolith, authentication type, session, JWT, and OAuth 2 are choices. Database type, whether you want to do a SQL or a NoSQL database. And the build tool, whether you want to use Maven or Gradle. And then, of course, the web framework, right? Angular, React, or Vue. And it also comes with JUnit 5 and Jest in there for testing the back end and the front end. And we also offer Protractor, Cypress, and Gatling for performance testing. And so one of the easiest ways to get started, if you're familiar with start.spring.io, we have something similar called start.jhipster.tech. And you go here, you log into the site, and then it'll allow you to basically generate your app, right, through a web page and put it on GitHub or download it. And so this is JDL Studio, and this is a language that we developed. That's how we know we're hip, because we have our own JHipster domain language, right, JDL. And so it allows you to define an application here, right, your gateway, reactive true, all that kind of stuff, and another application. So it allows you to do a whole suite of like microservices at one point. And it's a thriving open source project. So like I said, it was started in 2014, I think I said, but it was actually 13. And so the initial commit message was Hipster stack for Java developers. Yeoman, Maven, Spring, plus AngularJS in one handy generator. So that was from Julien Dubois, one of the founders. First public release, 0.3.1, was launched December 7th, 2013. And we almost had 2 million downloads last year. So it's grown quite a bit since then. And so, man, just talking about it makes me feel a little more hip here. So I'm going to have to change my shoes. This was a lot easier and doing it on Zoom, because you just showed people that you changed your shoes, but you didn't actually have to. But now we're back in person, I gotta actually do it. So bear with me, grab a drink, something like that. Should have got slippers, right? But those aren't that hip. I do have a cool pair of Michael Jordans, like from 1985, that my wife got me. Those have been cool to wear. And notice my cool socks. Those are hipster socks. And you probably didn't even notice I had skinny jeans on, did you? All right, that's all part of the hipster bit. So we got the nice socks. These shoes that shouldn't have been double knotted. I wonder when the last time I wore them was. It's probably at a conference somewhere. All right. Whew, should have got a fan. All right, so in case you don't know me, my name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana, no electricity and no running water. I did have to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, but it was pretty nice in the winter. This is the cabin I grew up in on the left here. This is my dad's attempt at a sauna business. He built one, couldn't sell it, turned it into a bedroom. So worked out pretty nice. I live here in Denver, Colorado, actually Centennial, on this same mineral, but over by Parker, with my beautiful wife, Trish, my awesome kids, Abby and Jack. Notice that Jack's a little bigger now. All right, he's the tallest one in the family. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004. You could also call him a very expensive obsession. I did drive him yesterday to a party at Jack's mom's house, and for some reason, he just stopped working on the way over there. Like, nothing. Like, no key, no electricity at all. So, we let it sit for an hour, came back, tried to fix it up. Still couldn't get it working, so we called AAA to tow it up to our shop that we use in Fort Collins. And for the weirdest reason, they asked us if the plates were expired. And we were like, well, yeah. And they were like, we can't do it then. And so now I got to get the plates fixed before I can even get it towed anywhere. So that's kind of a pain. But I work for Okta. You can call it Okra. Also, a lot of people say Okta, right? But the correct pronunciation is Okta. And we do users as a software service, or UAS, which is a terrible acronym, right? That's not what we really say. I like to say we just do users as a software service and authentication. So I'm feeling pretty talking about Okta. So take my coat off. Yeah, that's probably the hardest part. I used to actually keep the shirt on the whole time, and I'm like, why are you doing that? You gotta cool off. So I like to get a little more hip. Oh, everyone's like, I can't hear him anymore. It's because my mic was down there, so we'll get this shirt off. So while we're doing that, we can talk about the history of Spring. Spring was first created October 2012. Rod Johnson wrote this book called J2E Design and Development, and Jürgen Haller read it, found it, and was like, this is a great idea, where's the code? He gave him the code, and they turned it into, you know, what we now know as Spring. So that was a big deal back then, right? You didn't have to use EJBs, and everything worked really nicely with Spring. 2004, Spring 1.0 came along. That's when I adopted it, my AppFuse project. 2006, all of a sudden we got a lot better XML configuration because they had namespaces, so our XML was reduced a fair amount. 2009, Java config came out. But you know what happened in like 2010 and 12? I remember working with clients and then being like, Spring just sucks because it's all XML. And you were like, no, this Java config thing, like, why don't you use that? But everyone still had just reams of XML, so it became XML hell, right? And then Spring Boot 1.0 came along and added their starters and gave the ability to really get rid of a lot of that XML, and people did. And so then Spring Cloud was released the next year, and so that really, you know, gave us a boom for microservices in the Java space. Now it's YAML hell, right? Like, it's whatever markup that you're dealing with, and, you know, it just, you hate it every time, right? We loved YAML when it first came out because we were like, duplication of properties file sucks. I like YAML. And now that we're doing YAML all the time, we're like, YAML sucks. But, you know, if it wasn't YAML, it'd be something else that we hated. So, microservice visionaries, these guys were some of the ones that started it. James Lewis, Martin Fowler, old Adrian Cockcroft there, and Joel Wallens. And so, if you look at the term microservices, it goes back all the way to like 2006, 2007. It was mentioned at a conference. It was 2 words, and it was like microservices. And they talked about, you know, fine-grained SOA. That's what Adrian Cockcroft called it. He was from Netflix, and he was the first one that like took it to scale. And you'll notice a lot of the Spring Cloud bits that came out in 2015 were from Netflix and their open source projects to really, you know, allow things to talk to each other. And so Martin Fowler and James Lewis wrote an article titled simply Microservices in March 25th, 2014. And it's still one of the biggest, you know, differentiators and definitive guides for what are microservices. And so Conway's Law, he references this in, you know, part of that blog post. And it's any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So this is important because what you typically have is you have UI specialists, you have middleware specialists, and you have DBAs. And so those are siloed functional teams, right? And you see this at companies all the time. And then, you know, it leads to a siloed application architecture because what happens is the UI people are like, I hate talking to the middleware folks. Those guys take forever. Let's just do it in the UI, right? So they write more JavaScript to make it happen, whatever. The middleware people, you know, they can't get on the schedule for the DBAs, so they, you know, do it in their code instead of in the database. And then, you know, the DBAs write their stored procedures and push it out. So everyone's kind of siloed, and so it's very tough to do microservices with that kind of situation. So that's why they recommend, you know, you have a team for microservices that can do everything, all the way from the DBA to the middleware to the UI. And if you can't do that at your company, chances are microservices ain't going to be great for you. Like, don't even start, right? Just continue doing it the way you're doing it because it's going to be more hassle, right? It's really tough to develop with these siloed teams, especially in microservices, because the whole point is, you know, do one thing and do it well, right? And just concentrate on that. And you should be able to go all the way from product ideation to production and then monitoring production, you know, within your same team. You shouldn't have to reach out to other teams. So, you know, definitely consider that as you're adopting microservices. And so Spring Boot does Java very well, right? It's become like the on-off switch of enterprise Java. Everyone, you know, is using it and loving it. Gives you all those defaults, all those starters. And Spring Framework 5.0 is the basis of Spring Boot. I don't know if you saw last week at Spring 1, they announced that Spring 6.0 is going to be released in Q4 of next year. So that's quite a ways out, right? Spring Boot 3.0 will follow it. So, you know, it needs to have Spring developed first before it can, you know, add the boot component. But they're doing a cool thing. They're going to base it on Java 17. So that's going to be the baseline. Right? And so to use Spring 6, you have to use Java 17 or above. And the crazy thing is by the time it's released, we'll already be on like Java 20 or even 21, right? So it's not a bad idea because what they're going to have to do and what they plan on doing is building Spring for the next decade And so they want to baseline it on 17 because they're going to have to support like 10 different versions of Java, right? It's going to be 17 all the way to like 28, I think, is what Spring 6 is going to support over its lifetime. So there's a lot going on there. But Spring 5 was released in September 2017, so that's been a while, right? 4 years ago. And it builds on Reactor and the Reactive Streams specification, and it includes a new reactive runtime component model called Spring Webflux. And so Spring Boot 2.0 added Spring Webflux support, and was released in March 1st, 2018. So still, it's been a long time, right? And even JHipster, like we didn't have Webflux support until earlier this year, right? And we're in 2021, so what took so long? Well, it ain't easy, right? It's tough to do reactive programming because things look a little different. And people ask me, you know, when should I use Spring MVC versus Spring Webflux? And I have this quote from one of the Spring guys. I think it's from one of the Spring guys. He basically said, performance differences are negligible unless you're doing a lot of API calls at a scale of at least 500 requests per second, give or take. And so the whole point of, you know, reactive code and reactive architecture is it's not consuming resources on your server. It's non-blocking, right? It's returning, you know, to that user when it's done. And so it really scales your hardware better. So for companies that have hundreds of thousands, or probably not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of microservices running in a cloud somewhere, you know, if they can actually have less servers to handle more input, they actually save hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe a month, right? So it's a big deal for a lot of companies, and that's why, you know, Spring did the good thing and integrated it. So if you look at Spring MVC code, this is from a 21 points health application that I wrote. You can see it just has a create points method there, and it's pretty straightforward. It's very, you know, sequential, right? After one thing happens another. And then if you look at the Spring Webflux code for that same method, you'll see everything's kind of chained together, right? For that points repository, you save it, and then you flat map it and put it in Elasticsearch so it has those search records, and then you map that, and you're always like returning something, or you're flat mapping, you're mapping. So a lot of this is, you know, the Java Streams API. So if you learn the Java Streams API, you'll become familiar with a lot of how this stuff works. So it's a good exercise, I think. It's good knowledge to have. But the interesting thing is MVC was, you know, 14 lines of code, and Webflux is 22, right? So there's quite a difference there between the two. And so an API gateway is an integral part of a microservices architecture, as is service discovery. And so Spring Cloud Gateway is a way of doing this. This is just an example that I had where a user requests the cars, right, from this car service. Spring Security redirects you to log in somewhere like Okta. You know, the user authenticates and authorizes, and the JWT is, you know, sent to the API gateway, and the car service validates the JWT. It passes it from the gateway, you know, down to the car service. And that's one way to architect it. You could architect it other ways. The funny thing about this particular like graphic is that someone from Volkswagen contacted me and said, how do you know we were doing like our systems like that? And I was like, what? Like, can't be that simple. Come on, people, right? But yeah, so that was a funny LinkedIn thing that I got from them. And you know, friends don't let friends write authentication, so I am going to use OpenID Connect and OAuth in this situation. And OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, this is a graph of how it all works. So it used to be that you would finish your sign up at LinkedIn or your sign up at Yelp, and then it would prompt you to add, you know, more contacts. So it would give you a Gmail box that's like, put your username and your password here, and we'll go out and fetch your Gmail contacts, and then we'll send them all an invite email, right? Well, that's the wrong way to do it, because there's nothing that says that app won't have access to your credentials, right? You did put in your password. It could save your password and use it later, right? So the whole point of OAuth is allowing you to get permission to do something, you know, on a user's behalf, or an app to do something on a user's behalf. So in this case, what Yelp would do is you would click Connect with Google, right? And it would go to the authorization server. And so in that request, you pass in a URI, right, a redirect URI, and you pass in the scopes. And those scopes are normalized thanks to OpenID Connect. You log into authorization server. And I think it's important to point out, whatever happens after you hit this form to get you authenticated has nothing to do with OpenID Connect or OAuth or anything like that. It's all really about, you know, getting to here. Whatever happens there, you get like, you know, access tokens, or you get consent from the user, and then you come back, you go to that redirect URI with that authorization code, and then you use that code to exchange it for an access token and an ID token. And before OpenID Connect, there was no way to get identity. It was just using an access token, which is a random string of characters. You could go out and get, a person's contacts from Google, but you couldn't actually see who they were. So with OpenID Connect, you get that, and you can also get the user's information from that /userinfo endpoint. And so I think, this is essential for a microservices architecture to use something like OAuth, some, decentralized identity system. And then there's also Docker and Kubernetes, which you would probably want to use because a lot of people do for their microservices. I'm not going to go into them much, but JHipster supports both. So the demo I'll show you today is creating microservices with the JDL. We'll run the apps and some end-to-end tests, and then we'll switch from identity providers. We ship with Keycloak by default, and then I can switch it to use Okta. And I also have a demo using Auth 0, so if you're interested in that, I can show you that, but I'm also writing a blog post on that. And then we'll run everything with Docker. So let's giddy up here. So this is the point where I forget that I'm unmirrored, and you all are like, what's he talking about? So there we are. We're mirrored. We'll make that a bit bigger. Let's see, scaled. And Jack, you're probably going to want to show like mostly my screen during this part, right? Because it's a demo, and people are going to want to see that. So optimize for built-in Retina display. Scaled. There we go. Now it's nice and big, right? So Java microservice examples is a GitHub repo here that I have. And so this has a whole bunch of different projects in it that I've written blog posts for over the years. So there's just Spring Boot and Spring Cloud if you're interested in that. There's Spring Cloud Config and JHipster using Spring MVC. There's also this Reactive Microservices one, or that's the one with Spring Cloud Gateway, and then we have this one here, and there's another one, Kubernetes. So I'm just going to concentrate on this Reactive JHipster one. And what I have is this demo.adoc. And so this is an ASCII doc file that has like all my instructions in it, right? And I can put that on the left, and then I can kind of see what I'm doing. So the first thing you're going to want to do is install JHipster 7. So you'll do that npmi-g generator JHipster at 7. So that's how you do it. I already have it installed, and in fact, I'm using a nightly build just because I like to be freaky like that. So if anything goes wrong, I'll blame that. We'll create a directory called Reactive Stack. Why isn't this over there? Oh well. Take Reactive Stack, and then we'll get init, and this is because I'm putting all these microservices in the same mono repo. If you're going to have them in separate repos, like you don't have to do this part, but if you don't do this part, what happens is you get Git projects in each individual project, and so if you try to add it later as a whole thing to Git, then it has issues. So I just git init it right there, and then go down here, and this is JDL I talked about earlier, JHipster domain language. So we have this config, and the first thing we're going to develop is a gateway, right? That's the name, and reactive is true. And in fact, this is forced for the gateway. So we had this situation with JHipster when we were upgrading to Spring Boot 2.4. We used to use Zool for the Spring MVC option, right? And it would forward the request and act like sort of a gateway. Well, Spring Boot 2.4 and its version of Spring Cloud, it depends on, deprecated Zool and removed it. So Zool has a 2.0 version that is reactive, but basically the Spring guys were like, we can do better. We're going to build Spring Cloud Gateway and do it that way. So we, at the very nth hour, right, as we're doing this upgrade to JHipster and trying to push out a release, we realized there can be no more like Spring MVC Gateway version, because Spring Cloud Gateway doesn't have an MVC component. It only has WebFlux. And so they are working on it because there's enough people that are like, no, we like Spring Cloud Gateway and we don't want to do reactive. So there is an issue for that. But then we have the application type of gateway. Authentication type is OAuth. And so there's two ways to use JHipster, right? If you type JHipster, it'll prompt you for all these answers. The other way is, define all your answers up front. So we're going to use Gradle. We'll use Vue there. And then we'll use Postgres in production. And testing frameworks is Cypress. And the one thing that JHipster doesn't quite do well yet, and I think a lot of companies don't do it well, is the whole concept of a monolith UI. right? They're good at microservices, right? There's 4 or 5 different services on the back end, but the UI is still one big monolith that talks to all those services. So if you change anything in any of those services that requires UI changes, you have to deploy in both. And JHipster in its current version still has a similar architecture, but we have started adding support for micro front ends with Angular in particular, and how that works is the UI sits on the microservice. And so it sucks it into the main, gateway app, but it's still like independently deployable, and you don't have to modify the gateway that way. So there's a cool thing called module federation that Webpack provides, and allows you to actually treat like remote JavaScript as a source, right? And so that's how they do it. They just basically do their resolution at runtime. And so then we have a blog here, and it's got Neo4j for the database, and then we have a store that's got MongoDB, and they all have to use OAuth, and then we have our entities here. We have a blog, a post, a tag, and a product, and some relationships, many to one and many to many, and some Docker stuff down here. So we'll grab this guy here, and it shouldn't copy those little things in there, so yes. Why 2 different databases? Just to show that we can do it, right? There's really probably not a good idea in the real world, right, to have like Neo4j and Mongo, like just pick one if you're going to do NoSQL and do it that way. So yeah, good point. Okay, so then we can do JHipster, JDL, Reactive MS, and that will go ahead and generate all 3 applications, the blog, the store, and the gateway in parallel. So that's why you see things look funny here, and it's doing 2 projects at once. And because most of the code for the UI sits on the gateway, that's where it's going to store most of the JavaScript, the TypeScript, and all that. So it's also going to do an npm install there, which is what's going to take the majority of time for this. But we can look at some stuff while we're waiting. So we'll look at the gateway and pop that open in IntelliJ. So that JDL had post and the entities, right? And so it's a great question, because what it does is it actually uses Liquidbase. I don't know if you've heard of that, but Liquidbase and this source main resources, I think it's config here, yeah, Liquidbase file. So it'll take, and this master like schema is defining a bunch of stuff, and then it points to this initial schema file, and that's right here, and it creates like a JHI user table, and then authority, and a few other like tables. So when you generate entities, what will happen is these will actually end up with more changelog files here for the blog and for all of the various things, and it generates those tables on startup. Okay. Right? It doesn't use Hibernate's like schema generation or anything. It uses Liquidbase. And the nice thing about it is you can actually modify one of your entities, and you can run a command. You'd have to look it up. I don't know off the top of my head, but it'll create a diff changelog. So you can use that when you migrate, right, between databases for a release. So everything is in standard Java, right, source main Java. There's everything from that side of things, your domain objects, your configuration, like security configurations, all in here, using Spring Security, and then all your REST endpoints will be in Web REST, and then all of the web app is in source main web app, right? And so in this particular case, it's mostly an app, right, and that's all the view files and everything. And one of the cool things is JHipster actually has like 70% code coverage on a newly generated app, and that includes both Java and JavaScript. And if you're a fan, I'll show you at the end, you can use Kotlin too, if you'd rather not use Java. So just like we have those backends that are doing Quarkus or Micronaut, we have a Kotlin one that rewrites everything in Kotlin or whatever. And so that's still going. We can start some Docker containers in the meantime. So if we do ls source main Docker, there's a few files in there. There's JHipster Control Center. That's a separate project that was written to allow you to manage all of your projects with like a central admin UI. There's JHipster Registry and Keycloak and Postgres. We can start up JH Keycloak up. So that's an alias that I have, and I'll show you what it is. So if we do alias JH Keycloak up, it shows you that's just docker compose -f and pointing to the file, right? And we also need JH Registry up. And so these are just shortcuts that I installed. We have an OMyZSH plugin for JHipster that provides a lot of these that are super handy, because you can do like JH registry logs as soon as that finishes, and you can see it like starting up and all that kind of stuff. So those are super handy. And you can see that everything took about 3 minutes and 20 seconds to generate. And so, that registry starting up, we can go into the gateway and start that with Gradle W. And then we can go into the blog, and we'll need to start Neo4j, so JH Neo4j up. And then we need to go into the store and JH Mongo up. So you'll hear my fans, right, getting ready to go here. And this is definitely like not for the faint of heart, because you do have to increase your Docker settings. And if you don't, then it just won't work, right? So let me show you what mine are here as soon as I get this one going. If we go to images, or where is it? Containers, apps, maybe settings. Yeah, resources. And then see I have 8 CPUs and 25 gigs. This is one of those cool laptops that has like 64 gigs of RAM, right? So it's not a big deal. But if you leave it at the default, like something will fail to start. It might even be the registry, right? And you didn't notice that because you started in a Docker container. So you do have to bump things up a fair amount. And even in the Kubernetes tutorial I wrote, for it to work on like Google Cloud, you have to choose a minimum base machine, right? If you go any lower than that, it won't start up there either. So, we are working on native support. So I'll talk a bit about that at the end, and that would make it so it uses much less memory, but we don't have it yet. Oh, I forgot to start the blog here. Well, that's just a microservice, so it'll start up much faster, and we can go and we can look at JHipster registry. That's at 8761. So this is just, a normal like registry container. You'll see that Chrome actually doesn't like HTTP, so it tries to take me at HTTPS. That's just a Chrome thing. And then we type in admin, and it redirects us back. So how we configure Keycloak is we put a bunch of users in there. We put the application definitions, the redirect URIs, and all that in that Docker container. So when it starts, you don't have to go and build it. And it's part of the thing that when we deploy to Kubernetes, we actually don't generate any Keycloak configuration, because that would be weird to get you ready for production and pre-populate it with users and passwords and all that, right? You don't want to deploy your app that way. So that's why we recommend using an identity provider that's in the cloud, like Okta or Auth0, or I think anyone would work. It's just using standard Spring Security as like OAuth support. So you'll see everything's up now. We can go to localhost 8080. If we click sign in, we're back in, and then we can see our entities, right? We have a blog here. We can create a new one just to make sure that's working. So Matt's blog, and select the admin user here. So that one's working, and then make sure the product is working here, the Mongo database. So we'll just say beers 120 because we're in Norway or something like that. It's really expensive in Norway. It's crazy. And then we can choose an image there and save that. So everything's working, right? And if we wanted to run npm run e2e, that will fire up the Cypress test. And so the cool thing about this is it generates tests for all those entities, so you can basically test that your whole system is working, right, by running your Cypress tests. And even if you switched like providers and were using someone else, right, like say, Okta or Auth0, you can just override the default username and password with environment variables, and then, it'll work against those providers as well. And so Cypress is actually pretty unique. It only tests like a certain site. It doesn't allow you to do like the redirect Okta to log in or redirect to Keycloak. Like, that's not part of their suite. They want you to stay on a particular site. And so we had to write particular functions to go out and do the authentication like with an API behind the scenes. And so it works well now that we figured it out. But in the beginning, we were used to Protractor that kind of just let you drive all over, right? And, do what you needed to do. And Cypress has been much more stable for us. So Protractor, we had a lot of CI failures a lot of times that were just kind of false positives. And so things are working much better now with Cypress, and we know when things are breaking. So let's go back to my instructions here, see where we're at. I think the next step is to generate Docker containers. Oh, I wanted to point out, so Keycloak, you'll see it redirected, right? And we saw that error in Chrome. You do have to add Keycloak to your etc host file, because normally with Docker containers, they talk to each other through like a .worker network, right? And they use just host names to talk to each other. So it would be like the Postgres database, or it would be, the other server. And you never see that publicly exposed. Well, with Keycloak, since it redirects and it's in your browser, it actually is going to say Keycloak in there. So the only workaround we could figure out was to add it into your etc host file. So If anyone knows of a better way of doing that, I'd love to hear it, but that's how we do it right now. And so, talking about Spring Cloud Gateway, this is all you need to do to relay an access token from the gateway down to other microservices. And you might want to actually, connect your microservices to your gateway differently, maybe using client credentials with OAuth, but then you don't have any user information, right, down in your microservices. So one of the things I really liked with Spring Security when it came out, developing monoliths, was it had the security context holder. And even if you're way down in a DAO, you could get the user's information. I always felt that handy. So that's how we've kind of coded the OAuth support as well, is so if you want to actually get the user's identity or information down in a microservice, you can, and that's because of this, 5 lines of code in Spring Cloud Gateway. And so I have the Okta CLI installed. You see all our test pass there, and the CLI is at, we just got a new site, so I like to show it off, cli.okta.com. And the biggest reason for this was, doing demos like this, it was kind of a pain in the ass to show people all the things you had to do to set up a JHipster app, because you have to go and create role admin and role user as groups, right? Because JHipster expects those. You had to go create users. You had to add a claim or an access, or what's it called? It's called a groups claim, right, in the access token, so it has the groups that they're in and all this stuff. So we just added support right into our CLI, and it works much better that way. So if we were to go into the gateway here, we can just do Okta apps create JHipster, and it'll prompt you for a name, and it'll give you the defaults, which are what we want. And we have 2 redirect URIs in there because you can use Okta to actually secure the registry as well. So if you start it with OAuth profile, like you saw I was redirecting to Keycloak, we can do it there as well. So those are the 2 entry points, and then you'll see it created a client ID for us. It created that authorization server claims groups, and it already had the groups that requires, or JHipster requires, but I had already written those or done this before. So then it put everything in this okta.env, and the biggest thing you don't want to do with credentials like this is check them into source control. So this client secret right here, that's kind of like something you shouldn't put in source control. So if you run this command, make sure and git ignore star.env, so you're not checking those files in. And it's funny, JHipster actually, if you deploy to Heroku, it'll create a one-time password and put it in a file, and then make you change it, right? So it's not really that dangerous, but you can check in that file. I know this because I got busted by Okta a week ago or 2 weeks ago, where they were like, hey, you have some credentials in this GitHub repo that someone found on Bug Bounty, and they get money if they report things like this. So I spent an hour trying to rewrite the Git history, and then I was like, screw it, I'm just going to blow away the whole repo and then redo it. So you don't want to get into that situation, right? And if you do check in credentials, you do want to go rewrite your Git history so they were never in there. So that's what we have there. And then back to our instructions, what I can do is I can configure it to use Okta or another identity provider in a central location. Because we're using that JHipster registry and it has Spring Cloud config in there, it distributes that configuration to all the microservices. So we can grab this right here, and we can put it in this file, this gateway, source main docker application.yaml there. So if we were to go back to our project here, source main docker, central server config, and localhost right here, we can put it in this application.yaml. And then we'll have to, we can grab them right here, right? So grab this one and put it right there. And then client ID. And then client secret. And then we have to restart everything, so exit out of here and exit out of that one, and then JHipster registry down. And there is ways that you can configure Spring Cloud config with Actuator to allow you to refresh the configuration without actually restarting it. But it's kind of tough for these microservices, right, to pick up that without having similar refresh logic, but it is possible. No one ever likes to restart anything if they don't have to, right? Any questions while that's starting up? It's so nice to just be able to ask that. right? When you're on Zoom or you're doing like StreamYard or when we stream our meetups, like you ask someone a question and it'll come in like, 20 seconds later because of the delay. And if Jack's watching the YouTube, he'll let me know if anyone has any questions, right? But you're not watching it. We've actually gotten busted on this on Twitch. So I did a Twitch stream with a coworker, Brian Demers and Josh Long, and we were trying to figure out how to get the Okta Spring Boot starter to work with Spring Native. And it was cool because we did figure it out, right? It took us like 90 minutes, but we got, like, people left because we weren't talking to the people that were chatting to us, right? We were just like kind of one way, and we didn't realize it should be, more two-way. So I think here when we have an audience, it's not as expected that we're checking YouTube and talking to those folks, but keep that in mind if you ever do a live stream on Twitch or whatever. Like, people really want you to kind of monitor and talk to them and all that. So now we can open a new incognito window. And if we go to localhost 8080, first I'll show you the registry, right? That's using Okta as well. So it'll automatically redirect us to Okta there. And then as long as I remember my credentials, everything's good. Cool thing about Okta, you don't actually need the suffix of an email. I don't know if you knew that. So you don't need like @okta.com or @gmail.com. It'll figure that out. And so we're logged in there. And then if we go to localhost 8080, we can sign in here as well. Oh, hey, that one didn't work. Did we restart the gateway? Yeah. Let's try it again. Well, we'll just run it all in Docker and do it that way then, right? So I always have to Google the Docker command, so JHipster Docker. Is Docker compose here? Nope, nope, nope. Here we go. So this is how you build your Docker container with Gradle. So if we go to the gateway and do it there. And then we also will need to change, so we had this for the gateway. Well, when you're running it in Docker, we had the Docker compose configuration, so that's in a different file. If we go to cd docker compose, it's in this central server config, application.yaml. Oh, don't mess up the indent. Better just quit out of there. Okay. And then you can use Docker Compose up once those Docker containers are built, and it'll start your whole stack. So what I'll do is I'll wait until these are built, and then I'll start that. And it's going to take a while to start up. And even you can see here, it's funny that the TypeScript takes way longer to compile than the Java nowadays, right? Like I remember we used to wait for Java to compile all the time, and now like we're waiting for TypeScript to compile. So it is, building. Obviously the microservices are pretty quick, right? They build quickly because there's no front end, but this only took a minute, so not so bad there. And then if we go to Docker Compose, you can do Docker Compose up. And you can do -d if you want to run it as a daemon, right? But I like to do it as one big thing. Oh, we still have Docker containers running, so we want to stop all those. I have an alias, so dstop is my alias for those. Should stop all the containers. My laptop will get a breath before I start them all again. Then it'll be like, oh, really? All right, so remind me if I don't show you that it's all working there, because sometimes like I do the whole thing, I finish the presentation, and then, usually it's you shut off the Zoom or you shut off the StreamYard and you're like, I never showed everyone it all working. So remind me, please. So, we switched to identity providers. It worked for the registry. I don't know why it didn't work for the gateway, but hopefully it'll work here in Docker. And then this is a blog post I wrote that shows just Reactive Microservices Spring Cloud Gateway. So it's very bare bones. And the reason I mention it is because we've set everything up in JHipster using this same architecture. And so I wrote this blog post to like figure out how to do it, and then took my learnings and put them into JHipster. And obviously I had a lot of help because other people are OAuth experts on the project. And if you just want to know how Spring Cloud Gateway communicates with those microservices and what those microservices need to do, you can read that. The main difference is this uses like Okta Spring Boot Starter, which is a very thin wrapper around Spring's OAuth support. They have a resource server dependency, and they have a just OAuth 2 client dependency, and those allow you to do like OAuth 2 login and resource server where it just parses a JWT and lets you in. And so we learned a lot about, microservices, obviously the JHipster folks, and we have a bunch of new little icons here because we got some flack about having a white guy, which I think is appropriate. And so instead of just that guy, we got these folks, and we've even had some other ones created. So I do have a bunch of stickers over there that I brought, and I also brought a whole bunch of t-shirts that say, "I find your lack of security disturbing." They're really fun to wear in the airport because, like, no one smiles, right? Like, no one smiles, and they all read it, and so I had a couple years before COVID where I'd always wear that in the airport, and, like, every once in a while, like, someone would be like, "I need you to talk to my supervisor." And then they'd be like, "I'm just messing with you," right? But for the most part, no one really smiles, but everyone reads it. But I've learned, like, it's not a great travel shirt just because no one ever is, like, impressed by it. So I've started wearing tie-dye shirts more. And you wear a Grateful Dead tie-dye shirt, and holy cow, like, people come out of the woodwork. Everyone's got to tell you a story about when they saw Jerry and stuff like that. So this is like my, mean travel shirt, and then, the Grateful Dead one's a nice one. So the reason I mention it is I brought a whole bunch. One box has, like, mediums and larges and extra larges. The other one's all smalls, and they might work well for your kids. So I had, like, 50 of these for the last, like, 2 years and haven't been able to give them out. And they got so much cat hair on them that I had to wash them all to get to the States. So my goal here tonight is to get rid of all of them, and there might be 50 of them. So take a couple, take some home to your kids or whatnot, and then I think I'm just going to store them here at Thrive from now on instead of taking them home. And so this blog post, explains everything that I showed you in the demo, Reactive Java microservices there. And I also wrote one with Kubernetes, right? And so JHipster has a Kubernetes generator. I can show you it really quick. It's pretty easy to use. So if we were to go into this parent directory and do take like K8s and then run JHipster K8s, it'll prompt you for a whole bunch of Kubernetes information, what type of application. We'll say microservice. Where are your gateway and microservices located? We'll say the parent directory. It detects those, and we select them all. And then do you want to set up monitoring? You can with Prometheus. I'm just going to say no. Do you want to use clustered databases? It's only available with MongoDB and Couchbase. I'll say sure. And then it does talk from the microservices to the registry with HTTP basic authentication. So this is one of those situations where password is admin. Probably want to change that, right? Don't use admin. But the cool thing is when you deploy this by default to Google Cloud, it actually won't expose the registry, right? That 8761 is not exposed unless you use port forwarding, so it never needs to be available to your end users. It's just for those microservices. So all of that communication is happening in the back end. Should you use the default Kubernetes namespace? Probably not, so I like to use demo. And then the base Docker name is whatever you have on Docker Hub. Mine's Raible. And then Docker push is fine. Enable Istio, no, you can if you want. And then these are just the ones that I know worked for me. Do you want to use dynamic storage? Yep, and then you leave it blank. And then it generates, all those files for you. And so you can, Docker push them. You have to build your images, and then kubectl apply it, creates a script for that, and shows you how to get your IP address and all that. So let's see if everything's running in Docker here with localhost 8080. So now we're going to Okta, right? So, whew. It's no fun when the demo doesn't work, but it sure is nice when it does. So it'll come back, and then we could, view our entities, and our products might still be there. No, we're running in prod mode, so it regenerated those, and we have no more data. But looks like everything is working there, so that's nice. And then if you want to use Kotlin, you can. So the command to use it is npm install generator -jhipster -kotlin. And I did test this JDL that I'm using today. And the only issue that I had was with the Docker compose part. It does error out on that, but it creates all the microservices correctly. So I think they're waiting for a release of JHipster, probably the next one, 7.2. We'll fix that, and then they'll do a new release, and that Docker stuff will work right now. But if you're into Kotlin, check it out. And I really like JHipster because it really helps me learn how to do things. So a lot of times I'll just generate the app and check out the code, right? And when I used to be an independent consultant, I used to use like the code, right? It's an Apache license, it's open source. I can copy and paste that into someone's system. So I would use it to figure out how to communicate between different things. I think it's good to mention Project Loom, because Loom is intending to make reactive programming obsolete. They basically want to make it so your Spring MVC apps perform just as well as your Spring Webflux apps, because of Loom. So it's a way of doing threading that's much more efficient, and it could be, a big deal in Java. And a lot of people are betting on it, but when's it going to be released, right? It's coming in a JDK someday, but it's probably not 17 because that's like this week. It's probably not 18. It might be 19. So do you really want to bet on something that, might not be around? But I think it'll be cool. But I do think it's worth learning Spring Webflux and like the Reactor API because of, just the Java Streams API. Like once you know that, you'll know a lot of how reactive programming works. And so what's next for JHipster? I've been trying to get Spring Native to work for a couple months now, and I haven't spent too much time, probably 10 or 20 hours total. But I do think that's a big deal because what you can do with that is you can make native images with any old Spring Boot app, and since JHipster is a Spring Boot app, you should be able to do that. And so that'll allow you to run with 20 megs of memory, and you can start up in a second or two, and it might work well for serverless then. Micro front ends, we have it for Angular. We don't have it for Reactive View yet, but we are working on it. And then GraphQL, and I'm glad we paused on GraphQL and haven't really done a lot of work on it because one, there's like a PhD student that's like, this is my thesis. I will write this. So that's nice, right? We don't have to do the work, and he's been working on that for a while. But also, I don't know if you saw last week, but Spring Data announced that Spring Data GraphQL is now a thing. And so they took one of the popular open source projects that was doing Spring Boot and GraphQL and like made it theirs and brought it into Spring Data. And so, by waiting, now we're not like having to migrate to a different implementation because we're pretty much Spring throughout, and we can just use Spring Data GraphQL. And I do have this caveat that these are my personal interests, right? Like there's probably other people on the project that have other desires and other things that they will work on, but I do think the native is a big thing, and I think micro front ends is really necessary because if you're doing microservices and you have a monolithic UI, like you still have to deploy everything together, and the whole point is that they're independent. So yeah, JHipster is knowledge, right? Generate an app, check out the code. A lot of companies, I don't think, have the ability to start new apps, and they don't do greenfield development a lot. So I think, looking at it from that perspective of figuring out how to do something in your existing apps might be useful. I wrote a book on it. It's way out of date. Don't read it because it's like JHipster 5. I am working on updating it, so that'll maybe not be this year, but shouldn't be too hard because we've been pretty stable through our major releases. So I skipped JHipster 6. There's another book on JHipster 6 if you're interested. And then I developed a real-world app that was really fun as part of this. So my whole idea was that, a Spring Boot app has actuator and has the ability to like monitor the health of the app. So I wanted something similar for myself. So I wrote this 21 points app, and how it works is you get 3 points a day, and there's 7 days in a week, so you can get 21 points in a week. You get a point if you don't eat, or if you eat healthy. For me, that's like no sugar, low sugar. You get a point if you exercise, and you get a point if you don't drink alcohol. So I think now I allow myself like 1 glass of red wine, and I can still get a point, right? But anything over that, right, tonight I'm not getting any points. And so the goal typically is like 18 points in a week. 15 is a little easier, but what I've noticed is I used to get mad at, I used to be one of those parents that was like, those damn kids bring home so many colds, right? But what I learned was when I got less than 10 points in a week, that's when I got sick. And so if I stayed at like 15, 16 points a week, I wouldn't get sick. I was very healthy, right? So it changed my own perspective of my own life to be like, hey, when you're not taking care of yourself, that's when you're getting sick. So you can learn more about Spring Boot at spring.io/guides, JHipster at jhipster.tech, and Okta's APIs at developer.okta.com. And if you're like me, Stack Overflow, that's the lead developer on my team. A lot of times that's because my team is just me, and I'm an example programmer nowadays, let's be honest, right? I'm a developer advocate, and I write example apps, and my production is when the blog post is published, right? That's production for me. So I do still rely on Stack Overflow a lot because my team is made up of very different people, right? There's a couple Java folks, there's .NET folks, there's Node folks, and all that. And so check out our blog at developer.okta.com/blog. You can follow us at OktaDev on YouTube or Twitter or GitHub even. And my action to you is to try JHipster 7 if you have a need, and use the source. So there's a link at the bottom there for all the different examples. Keep in touch, my website. Follow me on Twitter. I will upload this presentation after tonight to Speaker Deck. There's already one up there, though, that I don't think anything's really changed much since then, so may the auth be with you.
We had a question about the slides.
Okay.
I put the link to the ones that you did for Denver Java user group.
Yep.
So is that good enough?
Yeah, and you know, I'll post another one just because the whole reason I post them on Speaker Deck is because I can go through at the end of the year and be like, how many times did I talk, right? And then I can just count them up. And usually I change the title slide, but I change it for the various places. And the last time I did it was at DJUG, all right? And we're DOSUG, we're still Colorado. And this is actually a photo that my wife took, Trish, up in Aspen of the Maroon Bells. And it was funny because we went up there leaf peeping, and a buddy of mine works for the Forest Service up there, and he's like, you got to get out there at like 4:30 in the morning if you want to get a spot because there's so many photographers. And if he hadn't told us that, like, she would have shown up at 8, right, and like not got a spot. But yeah, 100 people were there by 5 a.m., right, just waiting for the sunrise or whatever. So if you do photograph them, be aware. All right, any questions or we're good? All right. You could probably stop recording. We'll see if that worked. That was one of our big tests. It's the first time